What if I told you the Roman Empire didn't fall in 476 AD? That the history books you read in school got it wrong? That Rome, the real Rome, the one that outlasted every empire that tried to destroy it, survived for another 1,000 years after the date every textbook gives you. And that when it finally did fall, it fell in a single night, to a 21-year-old sultan with a cannon nobody thought was possible. This is the story of Constantinople, the city that was the last heartbeat of the greatest empire the world has ever seen. And the night that heartbeat stopped. To understand how Constantinople died, you first have to understand what it actually was. When most people think of Rome, they think of the Colosseum, the Caesar, the gladiators. What they don't think about is what happened after 476 AD, the year historians say the Western Roman Empire collapsed. Because in the East, the empire didn't collapse. It continued. It transformed. It became what we call the Byzantine Empire, though the people who lived in it never called it that. They called themselves Romans. They spoke Greek, they worshipped Christ, and they ruled from the most strategically positioned city on earth. Constantinople sat at the intersection of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, bridging Europe, Asia Minor, and the Balkans. Control this city, and you controlled the trade routes between two continents. Control this city, and you controlled the passage between two seas. Every empire that rose in the ancient and medieval world wanted Constantinople. And for over 1,000 years, Constantinople held them all off. Its legendary defenses were considered the most formidable in both the ancient and medieval worlds. The Theodosian walls, triple-layered stone fortifications stretching nearly 19 kilometers, had repelled Arab invasions in the 7th and 8th centuries. They had repelled the Bulgarians, the Rus, the Avars. Every enemy that came to the walls of Constantinople eventually turned around and went home. But by the 15th century, something had changed. Rome's last city was dying from the inside. The decay of Constantinople didn't happen overnight. It happened across centuries, through a combination of plague, civil war, and one catastrophic betrayal from the very people who were supposed to be its allies. Between 1346 and 1349, the Black Death killed almost half the inhabitants of Constantinople. A city that had housed 400,000 people at its peak had shrunk to somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000 by the mid-1400s. The streets that were once the center of the civilized world were now half empty. The great forums and markets were deteriorating. By 1453, Constantinople had become a series of walled villages separated by vast open fields, all enclosed within those ancient 5th century walls. The shell of an empire still stood. The empire itself was barely breathing. And then there was the betrayal of 1204. The Fourth Crusade, an army of Western Christians who were supposed to liberate Jerusalem, turned on Constantinople instead. They broke through the gates, looted the city for 3 days, and installed a Latin emperor on the Byzantine throne. The Greeks remembered with bitterness the capture of Constantinople in 1204 at the hands of Western Crusaders. Even after the Byzantines reclaimed their capital in 1261, the wound never healed. The Orthodox East and the Catholic West, two branches of the same faith, had become enemies. And that rift was about to cost Constantinople everything. Because when the final threat arrived, Byzantium would beg the West for help. And the West would argue about church politics while the walls came down. His name was Mehmed II. He became Sultan of the Ottoman Empire at 19 years old. His own father had tried to take Constantinople and failed. Mehmed had grown up with that failure as a personal obsession. The attacking Ottoman army was commanded by the 21-year-old Mehmed II, while the Byzantine army was led by Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos. The contrast between these two men tells you everything about what was about to happen. Constantine XI was an emperor in name only, ruling over a rump state that barely extended beyond the city walls. The empire by 1453 was not simply a smaller state, it was a city-state of Constantinople and a semi-autonomous region in the Peloponnese. It was beyond recognition. His navy, 26 ships, most of which belonged to Italian merchants who had chosen to fight alongside him. Mehmed arrived at the gates of Constantinople in April 1453 with an army of over 80,000 soldiers. He had spent the previous year cutting off Byzantine access to the Black Sea by constructing a fortress at the narrowest point of the Bosporus. He had recruited a Hungarian gunsmith named Urban, who had actually first offered his services to Constantine, who couldn't afford to pay him. Men could. Urban built an enormous cannon nearly 27 feet in length, capable of firing a 1,200-pound stone ball nearly a mile. They called it the Basilica. Nothing in the ancient world had ever been built like it. The defending army was composed of fewer than 5,000 Byzantine soldiers, not a sufficient number to adequately cover the length of the city's walls, some 19 kilometers in total. Men surrounded Constantinople from both land and sea. On April 6, the cannon opened fire. For 53 days, Constantinople held. What happened during those 7 weeks is one of the most remarkable last stands in human history. The defenders, outnumbered 10-1, exhausted, running low on supplies, repaired the walls at night that the cannon damaged during the day. The Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani led the land defense with a discipline that repeatedly pushed back Ottoman assaults that should have been overwhelming. Constantine sent desperate messages to every Christian power in Europe. Hungary refused. The Pope sent letters instead of soldiers. Venice dispatched a fleet that departed too late. Europe was consumed by its own wars. The 100 Years' War was draining France and England, Spain was finishing the Reconquista, and the Holy Roman Empire was fractured by internal conflict. Constantinople was on its own. And still the city held. Mehmed himself began to doubt. By the evening of May 27, even Mehmed too was considering negotiating with the defenders. At a council meeting that evening, the commander Zagan Pasha rose and passionately pushed his colleagues to finish what they had started. The Ottomans resolved to make one final assault. On the night of May 28th, something remarkable happened inside the city. On the night of the last day of the empire, the citizens of Constantinople, Greek and Latin alike, gathered together for Mass at the Hagia Sophia. Former enemies, divided by centuries of religious argument, prayed together in the great cathedral that had stood for 900 years as the heart of Byzantine Christianity. They knew what was coming. They prayed anyway. The final assault began before dawn on May 29, 1453. Wave after wave of Ottoman soldiers hit the walls in darkness. The first waves, irregular troops sent in to exhaust the defenders, were repelled. Then came the Anatolian regulars. Repelled again. Constantine XI, the last Byzantine emperor, was last seen casting off his imperial regalia and throwing himself into hand-to-hand combat after the walls were finally breached. Briefly, he disappeared into the fighting. His body was never conclusively identified. A gate, historians debate exactly which one, was left unlocked or found unguarded. Ottoman soldiers poured through. The city that had held off the world for 1,000 years fell not from a catastrophic breach of its walls, but through a single open door. On May 29, 1453, Constantinople fell. Mehmed II made it the new Ottoman capital, replacing Adrianople. He rode into the Hagia Sophia, ordered it converted into a mosque, and declared himself, in his own words, Kaiser I Rum Caesar of the Romans. He believed he had not destroyed Rome's legacy. He believed he had inherited it. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We cover the history they never taught you in school every week. The fall of Constantinople didn't just end an empire. It reshaped the entire world. The fall also severed the main overland trade route between Europe and Asia. With that route closed, European merchants began desperately searching for an alternative path to the east. Within 4 decades of Constantinople's fall, Christopher Columbus would sail west looking for Asia. Vasco da Gama would round the Cape of Africa. The age of exploration, which produced the modern world as we know it, was triggered in direct response to a city falling in a single night. The Greek scholars who fled Constantinople brought with them the preserved knowledge of Byzantine civilization to Western Europe. Many modern historians agree that this exodus marked not just the end of the Middle Ages, but the beginning of the Renaissance. The books, the manuscripts, the philosophical texts that had been kept alive in Constantinople for centuries, they flooded into Italy, into Florence, into the workshops of Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. The fall of the last Roman city lit the spark of the modern world. A Roman emperor died fighting in the streets in the dark hours of May 29, 1453. He took off his crown and picked up a sword because there was nothing left to do but fight. The city his ancestors had defended for 1100 years fell before the sun came up. The Roman Empire that had begun roughly in 27 BC, a civilization that had lasted nearly 15 centuries, ended not with a surrender document or a peace treaty. It ended with an emperor whose body was never found, in a city whose name the victors immediately changed, whose greatest cathedral became a mosque before the blood on the streets had dried.
Best in the
The
bazaar.
empire died. But the idea of it, the laws, the architecture, the philosophy, the art that survived. It traveled west with the refugees, took root in Italy, and eventually became the foundation of the civilization you are living in right now. Rome never really fell. It just changed hands.